The wind, a banshee scream, tore across the frozen expanse, each gust laden with ice needles that stung Elias Thorne's exposed face. He cinched the worn collar of his sheepskin coat tighter, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed against the blinding white. It was a fool's errand, checking the hide traps in a blizzard like this, but restlessness, a familiar phantom, had gnawed at him, driving him from the oppressive silence of his cabin. The world had shrunk to this swirling chaos, a maelstrom that mirrored the turmoil he carried within his own chest, a storm that had raged for a decade. He leaned into the gale, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving canvas of the Rocky Mountains, each step a testament to a stubborn will to endure. It was then, through a momentary lull in the wind's howl, that he heard it, a sound so alien in this desolate wilderness, so fragile, it almost didn't register. A whimper, thin and desperate, quickly swallowed by the returning fury of the storm. Elias froze. His head, framed by a frost-caked beard, tilted, listening. Animals, perhaps. A wounded coyote. But there was a human timbre to it, a note of suffering that resonated with a deeply buried chord within him. He adjusted the rifle slung across his back, its cold metal a familiar reassurance, and moved toward the sound, a dark shape pushing against the white onslaught. The snow deepened, drifting against fallen logs and ancient pines, making progress tortuous. He saw a depression in the snow first, a huddled form shielded, barely, by the meager lee of a granite outcrop. As he drew closer, his breath hitched. A woman. Her cloak, once perhaps fine, was caked with ice and snow. Her face, visible beneath a tangle of dark, frozen hair, was waxen, lips tinged blue. Her eyes were closed, but a faint tremor ran through her. And then he saw the bundle clutched to her chest, swaddled in layers of what looked like torn petticoats. From within it came another, weaker cry. A baby. Newborn, by the looks of it, thrust into a world as harsh and unforgiving as this blizzard. The woman's gloved hand, frozen stiff, lay protectively over the small form. Elias knelt, the wind whipping his own hair across his eyes. He reached out, his own weathered fingers brushing against her icy cheek. His voice was rough, unused, like a rusty hinge. No response. Her breathing was shallow, a feather's flutter. The baby, however, let out a more insistent wail, a tiny spark of defiance against the overwhelming cold. He looked around. No tracks visible beyond the immediate disturbed snow, swallowed by the storm. No horse. No supplies. Just this woman and child, on the precipice of oblivion. A familiar coldness, deeper than the wind's chill, settled in Elias's gut. Death was no stranger to these mountains, or to him. But this felt like a deliberate cruelty of fate, a scene designed to mock any notion of mercy in the world. His jaw tightened. The cabin was a good mile back, uphill, against this tempest. Taking them meant exposing himself further, sharing what little he had. Leaving them was unthinkable, yet a part of him, the part that had sought this isolation, screamed for him to turn back, to preserve the hard-won numbness he'd cultivated. His gaze fell on the infant, its tiny, red face screwed up in a silent plea. He remembered another small face, another life extinguished too soon, a memory that was a constant, burning ember in his soul. The decision, when it came, was not a conscious thought but an instinct, a muscle memory of a man he once was. He carefully, gently, pried the bundle from the woman's unresisting arms. The baby was small, so terribly small. He tucked it inside his own coat, against the warmth of his chest, its fragile life a sudden, immense weight. Then, with a grunt of effort, he scooped up the woman. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile burden. He straightened, the wind tearing at them, trying to rip them apart. "Hold on," he muttered, more to himself than to the unconscious woman or the infant nestled against him. Just hold on. He turned his back to the worst of the wind and began the trek, each step an act of defiance, a prayer whispered into the heart of the storm. The snow bit at his face, the path was treacherous, but the small, warm weight against his chest, the faint, trusting sighs of the babe, fueled a resolve he hadn't felt in years. He was no savior, just a man who knew too well the cost of loss, and in that moment, under the screaming sky, he would not let it claim another. The swirling snow tried to erase his tracks as soon as they were made, but Elias Thorne pressed onward, a grim protector carrying a fragile hope through the icy hell. The cabin offered a refuge, however meager, from the storm's relentless assault. Elias kicked the door shut against the howling wind, the small, one-room space immediately feeling like a sanctuary. He laid the unconscious woman gently on his own narrow cot, the only bed in the place, her frozen cloak cracking as he moved her. The baby, still tucked inside his coat, let out a soft murmur. His first priority was warmth. The stone fireplace was cold, but he worked with an efficiency born of long practice, his calloused hands, surprisingly deft, coaxing a flame from dry kindling and hoarded logs. Soon, a small fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls and promising a slow return of heat to the frigid air. He peeled off his own snow-caked outer layers, then turned his attention to the infant. Unwrapping the makeshift swaddling, he found a tiny boy, pale but breathing steadily. Elias rummaged through a battered wooden chest, pulling out an old, soft wool shirt, long unused. He tore a strip from it, carefully cleaning the infant, his large, rough hand surprisingly gentle. He then wrapped the baby in the remainder of the soft wool, fashioning a warm, secure bundle. There was no milk, of course. He found a small, clean tin cup and spooned a little lukewarm, slightly sweetened water, snowmelt heated by the nascent fire, offering it to the baby's lips. The infant suckled weakly at first, then with more vigor, his tiny eyes, dark and unfocused, fixed somewhere beyond Elias's weathered face. A strange pang, unfamiliar and almost painful, went through Elias. He hadn't held a child in a decade, not since. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the immediate task. The woman on the cot moaned softly, her eyelids fluttering. Elias approached, his expression unreadable. He needed to get her out of those frozen clothes. It was a matter of survival, not propriety, but a stiffness, an awkwardness, came over him. He hesitated, then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the mountains, he began the difficult task, his touch impersonal, functional. Her undergarments, though tattered, were of a finer quality than anything usually seen in these remote parts, a subtle hint of a different life. He managed to cover her with his spare blankets, tucking them tightly around her. He noticed a thin gold chain around her neck, disappearing beneath the rough wool of his shirt he'd used to cover her. He didn't investigate. Her story was hers, unlikely one of sorrow, given her predicament. Throughout the long hours, as the blizzard continued its assault outside, Elias tended to them. He fed the fire, checked on the woman's breathing, offered the baby more water. He moved with a quiet intensity, his face etched with fatigue but also a grim determination. The cabin was sparse, holding only the essentials for a solitary existence, a rough table, a single chair, shelves holding a few provisions, a worn Bible he hadn't opened in years. On a small, crudely made shelf near the hearth sat a single, small, carved wooden bird, its paint faded, its form smooth from countless touches. His eyes lingered on it for a moment, a flicker of profound sadness in their depths, before he turned away. The woman, Seraphina as he would later learn her name, drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes her eyes would open, clouded with fever and confusion. She'd murmur words he couldn't understand, phrases in a language that sounded formal, foreign. Once, her gaze briefly focused on him, a flicker of fear in their depths, before she lapsed back into delirium. Elias said nothing, simply offered her a little water, his presence a steady, silent watch. He noticed her hands, though bruised and scraped, they were slender, unaccustomed to hard labor. Her features, even pale and drawn, possessed a refined beauty. This was no homesteader's wife lost on the trail. The mystery of her presence, of how she came to be alone in the heart of such a brutal storm, with a newborn child, hung heavy in the small cabin, unspoken but palpable. Elias, however, was a man who had learned not to ask questions whose answers he might not want to know. His concern was survival, theirs and, by extension, his own renewed sense of purpose, however fleeting. As dawn approached, the wind began to subside, its roar diminishing to a mournful sigh. The fire burned low, casting a soft, orange glow. The baby slept soundly in a makeshift cradle Elias had fashioned from a wooden box, placed near the warmth of the hearth. The woman's breathing was deeper, more regular. Elias sat in the lone chair, watching them, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He hadn't slept. The silence, now that the storm was passing, was profound, broken only by the soft crackle of embers and the gentle breathing of his unexpected charges. He felt an exhaustion that went bone deep, yet beneath it, something else stirred, a sense of quiet satisfaction, perhaps, or merely the absence of the gnawing emptiness that had been his constant companion. He had faced the storm, and for now, they had weathered it. But he knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in his stomach, that the storm that had brought her here might have other, more human, furies following in its wake. The calm that settled over the mountains with the storm's passing was deceptive, a fragile peace soon to be broken. Elias had ventured out at first light, the world transformed into a pristine, silent sculpture of white. He'd cleared a path, checked his snares, empty, as expected, and surveyed the landscape, his eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance beyond what the blizzard had wrought. He saw nothing, but the unease remained, a cold knot in his gut. Inside the cabin, Serafina was awake, truly awake for the first time. Her eyes, a startling shade of violet, were clearer now, though fear and exhaustion still shadowed them. She was weak, propped up against the wall on the cot, the baby nestled beside her, swaddled in Elias's old shirt. When Elias entered, stamping snow from his boots, she flinched, her hand instinctively going to her child. He is well," she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper, her English accented, precise. Elias nodded, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly as he looked at the infant. Fed him some water. "He's strong." He moved to the fireplace, adding more wood. "You need food." "Broth, if I can manage it." He didn't have much. "Some dried meat, a little flour, coffee. Sustenance for one, not three." Serafina watched him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. You saved us," she said, the words catching in her throat. "From the storm anyone would have," Elias replied gruffly, though they both knew that wasn't true in these harsh lands. He didn't look at her, uncomfortable with her direct gaze, with the emotion in her voice. He busied himself making a thin broth from a piece of dried venison. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the baby's soft sighs. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice a little stronger. Elias paused, ladle in hand. "Name's Thorn." Elias Thorn. He offered no more. She seemed to understand this was all she would get. I am Serafina," she offered, then hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. She didn't offer a surname. The day wore on. Elias tended to their needs with a quiet efficiency. He melted more snow for water, prepared what meager food he could. He spoke little, his words functional, necessary. Serafina, regaining some strength, focused on her son, whom she quietly called Wilhelm. She hummed soft, foreign lullabies to him, her eyes rarely leaving his tiny face. She observed Elias, this quiet, weathered man who had plucked them from the jaws of death. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes, the grief that seemed to cling to him like the mountain cold, yet she also saw the capability in his hands, the unwavering resolve in his rare, direct glances. He was a puzzle, a contradiction of harsh exterior and unexpected gentleness. Late in the afternoon, as a pale sun began its descent, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, Elias was outside, chopping more firewood. His senses, honed by years of solitude and a past he never spoke of, suddenly sharpened. A sound, distant but distinct, the jingle of harness, the crunch of snow under multiple hooves. Not the sound of a lone rider. He straightened, axe still in hand, his eyes scanning the tree line to the east, the direction of the only viable pass. A moment later, they appeared. 3 riders, dark figures against the snow, moving with a purpose that brooked no argument. They were heavily armed, their faces hard, their eyes sweeping the landscape with predatory intent. Elias felt a cold dread solidify. His instinct had been right. The storm that had brought Serafina had indeed been followed by furies. He watched them approach, his own face grim, his hand resting on the handle of the axe. There was no doubt in his mind, they were looking for her. One of the riders, a burly man with a cruel scar bisecting his left eyebrow, kneed his horse forward as they reached the edge of the small clearing around the cabin. His eyes, cold and assessing, fixed on Elias. "You there, old man," the rider called out, his voice harsh, arrogant. "Seen a woman pass this way? Dark hair, desperate. With a babe, maybe." Elias didn't move, his gaze steady. "This is my land." "State your business." The scarred man, clearly the leader, let out a short, humorless laugh. The other two, equally menacing, fanned out slightly, their hands near their holstered guns. Their eyes flicked to the cabin, noting the thin wisp of smoke from the chimney. "Our business is finding what's ours," the leader sneered, his gaze returning to Elias, sharp and dismissive. "She's stolen property. We're here to collect stolen property." The words, so casually dehumanizing, sent a shard of ice through Elias. He thought of the young woman inside, her violet eyes filled with fear, clutching her newborn son. He thought of the quiet dignity with which she bore her suffering. His grip tightened on the axe handle. "There's no one here but me," Elias said, his voice low, flat, carrying a warning that the scarred man either missed or chose to ignore. "Now move on." The leader's eyes narrowed. He looked Elias up and down, taking in the weathered clothes, the solitary cabin, the man's apparent age. Contempt flickered across his face. "Don't be a fool, old-timer. We know she came this way." The tracks were faint, but not that faint for keen eyes. "Hand her over, and we'll be on our way." "No trouble for you." He patted the butt of his pistol meaningfully. Inside the cabin, Seraphina had heard the voices. Her face, already pale, went ashen. She clutched Wilhelm tighter, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. She knew those tones, that arrogance. They had found her. Her momentary sanctuary was about to become a battleground. Elias saw the shift in the men's stance, the growing impatience, the readiness for violence. The sleeping giant within him, the part of him forged in the crucible of war and loss, began to stir. He had sought peace in these mountains, a quiet fading away. But peace, it seemed, was a luxury rarely afforded to those who carried the burdens he did. And injustice, especially against the vulnerable, was a spark that could still ignite the old fire in his soul. "I said," Elias repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying across the still air with chilling intensity, "move on." His eyes, cold as the winter sky, met the leader's, and for the first time, the scarred man seemed to register that this was not just some weary homesteader, but something far more dangerous. The air crackled with unspoken violence, the silence of the snow-laden wilderness amplifying the tension. Manfred, the scarred leader, scowled, his arrogance momentarily checked by the sheer, unyielding force in Elias Thorne's gaze. He hadn't expected such resistance from a lone mountain dweller. "Brave words, old man," Manfred spat, recovering his bluster. "But bravery won't save you from a bullet. She's coming with us, one way or another. The Baron wants his property, and what the Baron wants, he gets Baron." The word hung in the air, cold and significant. Just then, the cabin door creaked open a few inches. Seraphina stood framed in the opening, pale but resolute, Wilhelm held tight against her shoulder. Her violet eyes, though filled with fear, blazed with a desperate defiance. "I am no one's property, Manfred," she declared, her voice trembling but clear, carrying across the snow. "And this child is my son, not a chattel for Baron von Strauss to claim." Manfred's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then narrowed into slits of malice as he saw her. "Well, well." The little bird decided to sing. "Saves us the trouble of smoking you out, Baroness, Baroness." The title landed with the weight of revelation. Elias's head turned slightly, his gaze briefly meeting Seraphina's. He saw not just a desperate woman, but a noble woman, hunted and terrified, yet still possessing a core of unbreakable strength. It explained the fineness of her tattered clothes, her cultured speech, the sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes when she'd first regained consciousness. She was fleeing not just hardship, but a powerful, tyrannical man, her husband, the Baron. "So, you know her," Elias stated, his voice still low, turning back to Manfred. "It wasn't a question." She's the Baroness Serafina von Strauss, Manfred sneered, enjoying the disclosure. And her whelp is the Baron's heir. He wants them both back. She ran, thinking she could hide in this godforsaken country. He gestured dismissively at the vast wilderness. But the Baron has long arms and deep pockets. Serafina stepped further out, placing herself slightly in front of Elias, a fragile shield. He is a monster, Elias. He tried to, he would harm my child, harm me. I had to flee. Her plea was directed at Elias, her eyes begging for understanding, for continued protection. Elias's gaze softened for a fleeting moment as he looked at her, then hardened again as he faced Manfred. The pieces clicked into place. The desperation, the flight into a deadly storm, the terror. It wasn't just a domestic dispute. This was a fight for survival against a cruel and powerful man. And in Serafina's plight, in her fierce protection of her child, Elias saw an echo of his own devastating loss, the loss of his wife, Martha, and his little girl, Lily, to men just like these, greedy, violent, believing they had the right to take whatever, whoever, they pleased. That old wound, always simmering beneath the surface, tore open anew, not with grief this time, but with a cold, righteous fury. This was not just Serafina's fight anymore. It was his. She's not going with you, Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying the finality of a death sentence. Manfred chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. You and what army, old man? There's 3 of us, heavily armed. You're one man with an axe. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked echoing in the stillness. His 2 companions did likewise, their guns trained on Elias. This is your last chance. Step aside, Serafina gasped, her eyes wide with terror, pressing herself back against the cabin wall, shielding Wilhelm with her body. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the guns. His eyes remained locked on Manfred. You mistake me, Elias said, his voice a low growl. I'm not an army. I'm just the man who's going to stop you. And then he moved. It wasn't the hurried, clumsy movement of a frightened man. It was with the lethal grace of a predator, a sudden, explosive unleashing of coiled energy. He didn't go for the rifle leaning by the door. His weapon was in his hand. With a roar that seemed to come from the very depths of his tormented soul, he launched himself forward, the axe whistling through the air. Manfred, startled by the sheer ferocity of the attack, fired, but his shot went wide, Elias already too close. The head of the axe, not the blade, but the heavy pole, connected with Manfred's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. The pistol clattered into the snow. Manfred screamed, clutching his shattered hand. Before the other 2 could react, hampered by their surprise and the proximity of their leader, Elias was among them. He dropped the axe, his movements fluid, economical. A powerful blow to the side of one man's head sent him sprawling, dazed. The other lunged with his pistol, trying to bring it to bear, but Elias's hand shot out, grabbing the weapon, twisting it with brutal force. The man cried out as his wrist snapped. Elias disarmed him, then delivered a swift, disabling strike to his throat. It was over in seconds. Not a wild brawl, but a calculated, ruthlessly efficient dismantling of the threat. The 2 henchmen were groaning on the ground, incapacitated. Manfred, cradling his broken hand, stared at Elias with a mixture of agony and disbelief, his arrogance completely shattered. Elias stood, breathing heavily, his chest heaving, the fire of combat still blazing in his eyes. He picked up the fallen pistols, his movements precise, his gaze sweeping the area, ensuring there were no further threats. Serafina watched, stunned into silence, Wilhelm still clutched tightly. The quiet, weathered man who had shown her such unexpected kindness had transformed into a whirlwind of righteous fury, a warrior of terrible capability. He was more than just a recluse, he was a protector, a dangerous man when provoked by injustice. Elias turned to Manfred, who was trying to stumble to his feet. Elias's face was a mask of cold fury. The Baron was wrong, he said, his voice rough. His arms aren't long enough to reach here. Not anymore. He looked at the injured men. His fight was not with them beyond their immediate threat. Get on your horses. Take him with you, he ordered the two henchmen, who were now struggling to sit up, their faces pale with pain and fear. Tell your Baron what happened here. Tell him Serafina and her son are under my protection. And tell him if he, or any more of his dogs, ever set foot in these mountains again, they'll be buried here. There was no doubt in his voice, no room for negotiation. It was a vow, sealed in the snow and the blood of their defeat. The men, thoroughly cowed, scrambled to obey, helping their whimpering leader onto his horse. Within minutes, they were retreating, a broken and humiliated trio, disappearing back into the trees, leaving only the disturbed snow and the lingering scent of fear. Elias watched them go, his stance unwavering until they were out of sight. Only then did the tension slowly begin to drain from him, leaving behind a profound weariness, but also something else, a flicker of the peace that had eluded him for so long. He had not just defended Serafina, he had defended the memory of his own lost family. He had stood against the darkness, and for once, he had not failed. He turned back to the cabin. Serafina was staring at him, her violet eyes wide, filled with awe, gratitude, and a dawning understanding of the man who stood before her. The mystery of Elias Thorne was slowly unraveling, revealing a depth of sorrow, and an even greater capacity for courage. The immediate aftermath of the violent confrontation hung heavy in the crisp mountain air. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the distant call of a raven and the soft whimpering of Wilhelm, disturbed by the sudden eruption of violence and his mother's fear. Elias Thorne stood for a long moment, the discarded pistols still in his hands, his gaze fixed on the spot where Manfred and his men had disappeared. The adrenaline still coursed through him, but the cold fury was receding, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He was no stranger to violence, his past had been steeped in it, a life he thought he had left behind. Yet, it seemed, some battles found you, no matter how far you ran. He methodically emptied the chambers of the pistols, tossing the bullets far into the snowdrifts before dropping the useless metal by the woodpile. He wouldn't keep them. He had his rifle, and his axe, and his will. That was enough. Serafina approached him tentatively, her face pale but her eyes shining with unshed tears. She clutched Wilhelm, who had quieted now, his small face buried in her shoulder. Elias, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You saved us. Again. From much more than the storm he finally turned to her, his expression unreadable, the harsh lines of his face softened slightly by the ordeal. He saw the gratitude in her eyes, the awe, but also a lingering fear, not of him, but of the world that had pursued her even to this remote sanctuary. They won't be back, he said, his voice still rough. Not soon. They'll carry the message. He knew men like Manfred, their arrogance was a brittle shield, easily shattered by true, unexpected resistance. The Baron would hear of a madman in the mountains, a protector who fought like a demon. It might give him pause. But he will not give up, Serafina said, a tremor in her voice. Baron von Strauss, he is relentless. He will send others. More men. He believes Wilhelm is his. His heir Elias nodded slowly. He understood. Men of power and greed rarely relinquished what they considered theirs, regardless of the cost to others. We'll deal with that when it comes, he said, though a part of him knew this quiet cabin was no longer a safe haven for her, not in the long term. He looked at her, at the infant in her arms. A future had been thrust upon him, a responsibility he hadn't sought but now couldn't ignore. You're a Baroness, he stated, the title sounding foreign on his tongue. Serafina lowered her gaze. Yes. Serafina von Strauss. My husband, he is a cruel man. Powerful. Respected in our homeland, but a tyrant in his own house. When Wilhelm was born, I knew I had to escape. He spoke of ensuring Wilhelm was molded in his image, and that I was expendable once the air was secure. Her voice broke, and she fought back a sob. Elias felt a familiar ache in his chest. The casual cruelty of it, the dehumanization. He remembered Martha's laughter, Lily's small hand in his. Lost to fire and violence because men like the Baron believed their desires trumped all else. You did right to run, he said softly. You did right to protect your son. He gestured towards the cabin. Go inside. Rest. Both of you. The boy needs you calmed inside. The small fire Elias had built earlier still flickered, a small beacon of warmth and light. Seraphina sank onto the cot, her strength finally deserting her. Elias tended the fire, then prepared a more substantial meal than the thin broth of the morning, a stew of sorts, with the last of his dried meat and a few hoarded potatoes he'd kept buried against the frost. The aroma, humble as it was, filled the small space, a scent of normalcy in a world that had become anything but. As they ate, a fragile quiet settled between them. Seraphina watched Elias, her curiosity and gratitude warring with her exhaustion. You fought them like a soldier, she observed quietly. Elias paused, a piece of potato halfway to his lips. His eyes became distant, clouded with memories. He said, his voice flat. A long time ago. Different war. Different life. He offered no more, and she didn't press. She understood that some doors were best left unopened. The revelation of her identity, her title and wealth, hung in the air. Elias, she began, after a long silence, when I am able, when I can reach my family, my connections. I can reward you. Handsomely. For what you've done. You saved my life, my son's life. There is nothing I wouldn't give. Elias raised a hand, cutting her off. He looked at her, his gaze direct, unwavering. I don't want your money, Baroness. Seraphina looked taken aback. But you deserve? I did what any decent man should have done, he said, though he knew few would have risked what he did. There's no payment for that. He looked away, towards the small, carved bird on the shelf. Some debts can't be paid with gold. A profound sadness touched his features, a glimpse of the deep well of grief he carried. Seraphina fell silent, understanding, at least in part. His actions hadn't been transactional. They had come from a deeper place, a place of honor, perhaps, or a confrontation with his own ghosts. As night fell, a deep, star-dusted cold settled over the mountains. The threat, for now, had passed. Inside the cabin, Wilhelm slept peacefully in his makeshift cradle. Seraphina, wrapped in blankets, watched the stoic man who sat by the fire, his rifle now cleaned and resting beside him. He was a guardian, a reluctant hero forged in the crucible of loss and solitude. She owed him everything. He, in turn, had found something he hadn't realized he'd lost, a reason to fight, a reason to protect, a flicker of light in the long darkness of his self-imposed exile. The storm had brought them together, two souls adrift in their own frozen wastes. And in the heart of that storm, in the face of brutal tyranny, an unexpected sanctuary had been found, and a quiet, profound redemption had begun to bloom, as fragile and precious as a newborn child in the snow. Elias found a measure of peace in the heart of that storm, a redemption written in the innocent eyes of a child. What choices define us when the blizzards of life descend? If you were faced with such a choice, to risk all for a stranger, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, click here for another tale of courage, and don't forget to subscribe for more.